Howdy, y'all. My name is Tiffany Keith, and welcome to Sermon Roundtable, where we invite you into the pastor study as we struggle through our sermons for the week. I'm the preaching pastor of Heartstrings, Bluegrass Worship, Wild Hearts, and we meet each Sunday morning in the theater at First United Methodist Church in downtown Colorado Springs. Kent, who are you?
I am Kent Ingram. I preach the sanctuary services at 8, 9, and 11 at First United Methodist Church, and we get to work with these two great preachers every week. Really enjoy this. So, Patty, who are you?
Hi, I am indeed Patty, as Kent said. I'm Patty. I'm the pastor of First United Methodist Church Prairie Campus, which is a satellite campus of FUMC located out on the eastern plains of the Springs. And why don't we, let's start with a prayer. God, we pray for anybody who might be listening to this. We pray for ourselves as preachers that somehow all our hearts would be open, that your spirit would blow through this time, and we might be inspired by you and by each other. Amen. I'll go first this week. I've been doing a sermon series on some parables from the Gospel of Luke. And I'm continuing with that this week. I'm turning to Luke 11, verses 1 through 13 this week. And in this passage, we see that Jesus, he's been praying, and his disciples, one of his disciples come to him and say, teach us, Lord, how to pray. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking that the way I understand that or want to approach that is that the disciple wasn't just asking, like, give us what specific words to say, but was more about, knowing that Jesus had this, completely unique and different relationship with God, with Abba, with his Father. And, I imagine the disciple longing for that. So I imagine this disciple really, the heart of his question is, how am I to be connected with God? How is it that I can draw close? How can I have a relationship with God like you have? This deep sense of communion. So I kind of want to broaden that question about how do I pray to, how is it that I'm connected with God like you are? So the first part, which I'm not going to spend time on in the sermon, is this kind of abbreviated Lord's Prayer that is in Luke, that's different from the more complete version in other Gospels. But then after this kind of like little abbreviated Lord's Prayer, Jesus tells them a parable. And sometimes this parable is known as the parable of the friend at midnight. But there's another name for it that I stumbled across that I really like. It's the parable of the grumpy friend. The parable of the grumpy friend. And I'll remind you of it. In this parable, there's this person, and they have somebody come visit them late at night. And of course, they want to show hospitality to them, a big part of the culture back then. And so they run to a friend around midnight to see if they can borrow bread, so they'll have some form of hospitality to share. So the friend, the grumpy friend, says, don't bother me, the door's locked, my kids are in bed, I can't get up, I can't give you anything. But the person is really persistent and continues to ask. And so finally, the grumpy friend gets up and gives something because of the person's persistence. So I think first I'll probably, try to do something kind of interesting and funny around this grumpy friend who doesn't want to get up and give the bread. And to think about, is that ever our experience in prayer? Do we ever have that experience where we feel like God isn't answering us, God isn't present, God doesn't want to respond? Have you had those moments in your life, kind of about unanswered prayer and things like that? but then to talk about somehow about how in this parable, like to see God as the grumpy friend, like that's a pretty problematic understanding of God, right? So yeah. Really in this parable, the parable is not about God. The parable is about the one who asks. That's what we're being invited into here, about this persistent person. And the way I get that is because of the very next thing that Jesus says, is then he goes on to talk about that as parents, you know, we love to give our children good gifts. But how much more, I love that phrase, but how much more does God give to those who ask? And what does God give? God gives the Holy Spirit. And that goes right back to the beginning thing about how the person was asking, how do I pray? How do I have communion with God? And so I think the two things that Jesus is encouraging us with this parable and with these words is to have connection with God, have persistence, and have trust. So the persistence is, you know, is the person who's at midnight, they're knocking, like keep drawing near to God, like not giving up, like keep pursuing God, keep asking, keep seeking, and do it in this place of knowing that God longs to give you God's self. God longs to give you the Spirit. God longs to give you God's presence. So anyways, I know it's kind of like all over the place. So I probably need to focus that. I don't know, that may be like too much to get all in one sermon. So I guess I just love to know, you know, what part resonates with you. What do you draw out of this parable?
You know, as you were talking about, I think what I would ask, and it's exactly what you asked that made me wonder more, is who is God in the parable? I mean, is God not in the parable? Is God, you know, the knocker? Is God the grumpy friend? That was really intriguing to me, but I don't know how that plays out in a sermon. I just know that as you were talking, that is like, I want to go read the text and I want to see, you know? And my other question as you were talking, so you said persistence and trust. And I wondered in that statement, what's the difference between trust and faith, or are they the same thing?
I mean, I don't know how you would term this, but just, you know, believing that God longs to give you good. Maybe not the good that you think, but the good of God's presence, and that God is working behind the scenes for you. I mean, I thought about one little silly illustration to use is, you know, Luke is playing tennis right now. And, you know, there's this whole culture of cheering in tennis. It is like, it's so different from other sports. Like, it's very refined. Like, the most you can do, you know, like the most you can do is like, you know, and, you know, you can never cheer when the other team does something bad. Like, that is really like unsportsmanlike or whatever. Anyways, but so I want them to imagine, but that's not how God is. God is not just like, oh, Tiffany, I see you're like helping Afghanistan refugees. Oh, no, God, like, you know, like that, you know, I read on Facebook this week that your image of God makes you. And so just, you know, having this image of God who is in your corner, who's cheering for you, who longs to give you God's self. So I don't know if that's trust or faith or whatever.
The persistent sounded like faith to me, like persistently knocking. And I think when you're persistent, sometimes you have doubts in the midst of persistence, but you persist anyway, or uncertainty. So that felt like faith. I think that's where I just intrigued by the wording, I guess.
Mm-hmm. in all the years I've been preaching, probably people are more intrigued by sermons on prayer than anything else. People love sermons on prayer. I get more comments about it. And there's two parts to any sermon on prayer. One is the how, and the other is the how does it work? You know, I mean, what do prayers look like? One of the best introductions to a sermon I've ever heard by Fred Craddock was one on prayer, and he was preaching from Paul, and he just went through all these quotes of Paul: "For I am convinced, for I am persuaded, for I believe, for I am not ashamed, but we don't know how to pray." was the next quote from Paul, which kind of sums it up, right? I mean, there is this. It is so simple, and yet we keep having to preach sermons on it. I mean, we keep having to read about it. We don't get it, and then there's always that sort of the out. We are, as good mainline preachers, we're going to give God the out, right? We're going to say, well, God's going to give us what God wants, or God here. I mean, but still, we know that we ask for stuff that doesn't happen, and we beg and persist, and we cry and we cling, and the bad things still happen, and theologically we can get our way out of that, right? Theologically we can help congregations understand, but I think at a visceral level, that's the problem with prayer. Is that it's not like a vending machine. I can't put a dollar bill in and get a Pepsi out. There's no control I have over that. So and I understand. I understand all the things around what prayer is, how it changes us, how it's listening. There's just a lot of things you can do with prayer. But I think people at least hunger for somebody else wrestling with that, somebody else naming that man, I prayed for things and they didn't happen. I prayed for things and the worst possible result came out. And, that's hard. The other thing that came to mind when you were talking about, Tiffany was talking about those images of God. The thing that came to my mind when you were talking about that is that we think of Jesus as being so, straight up, serious. He's all about the business. But I could imagine him with a twinkle in his eye and just a little bit of his smirk, telling this story about prayer. That does in fact describe God as a grumpy neighbor. There's something in me that is attracted to this Jesus that is playful in his understanding of in the telling of these parables and understanding of God. And, there's just something in me that enjoys that playfulness, that picks at that sort of seriousness that we always put with Jesus. And who knows? We psychoanalyze Jesus, we get him on the couch, we make him be who we want him to be. But I could imagine that. I could imagine him, describing God as a grumpy neighbor and kind of having fun with it, just kind of letting people wrestle with it. So, but yeah, you'll get a great response. People will love your sermon on prayer. I think that, the paths you can take are, here are the 4 steps on how to pray, or you can take the path of, like the disciples. I've been doing this a long time, and I still have to go to Jesus every once in a while and say, hey, teach me how to do this. This is not as simple or intuitive as I thought it was. I don't know. That's where my thoughts went.
That's great. That's great. I love it. Thank you all. Thank you. You're both really helpful. Great.
So I'm preaching on Mark 1, so 21 through 28. Again, I'm in this is a second week of, Welcome Home sermon series. And last week I talked about leaving home and the reasons why we leave. And the interesting thing about last week is, from my understanding from the sermon reflection groups, kind of talking about that. And in the group I'm in mentioned my sermon. We didn't talk about it. We talked about Kent's sermon, but, it really drew people into this conversation around what really is home. What does home mean to me? And so that was a good, I think, response for me. I think that's a good leaving people questioning and thinking and wondering. And then this week, I'm going to talk about those things that we see when we're away from home, like the things that just bring us awe. And maybe one of the things you can help me with is if maybe I should do this the other way, because next week I'm talking about the storms that we encounter away from home, like the hard moments. And I'm, now that I'm in the middle of it, I'm thinking maybe I should have done storms this week and then the seeing things next week. But so I'm, again, trying to kind of weave in, the church's history. So we're doing our 150th, and also COVID, this kind of this place where we all feel a little unnerved and maybe emotionally or spiritually homeless, or away from home anyway. And then if you look back through the history of the church, we have often found ourselves kind of feeling away from home. And yet, if we look, we will see, the miracles of God woven through our journey. So I'm looking at, so General Palmer came out here, and in some of his diaries or letters, actually, to his wife, Queen, he talks about the beauty of this area and just seeing Pikes Peak and the fields and the birds and the flowers, and kind of describes all of this stuff and is just in awe of this beauty. And then I'm going to talk about, I think I'm going to do a longer narrative section in the middle. So the disciples are just called. They immediately go to Capernaum and go to the synagogue, and Jesus is teaching. And there's this moment where they're just like in awe of his teaching. And there's moments in experiencing sermons that I know I've had through my life that I'm just, I get that in awe moment, these moments where you're like, wow, this is so different than what I've ever heard. It's breaking me out of the comfort of what I used to hear. Like Patty, I think about, kind of you and your history. There's some things that had to have happened for you to switch from, really the evangelical kind of side to going, wait, there's something else. And there's a feeling of not being home sometimes in those journeys. So they're just in awe of Jesus' teaching. And then there's an unclean spirit, or a guy with an unclean spirit, and Jesus heals him and calls the unclean spirit out of this guy. And the disciples are just like, wow, and just in awe and seeing this. And I wonder, I think where I want to go, I'm thinking with the sermon is, had they stayed home, had they said, no, not doing this thing, I want to be normal and comfortable, they wouldn't have seen these things. They wouldn't have seen these moments and seen Jesus at work in these ways. And in the end, I think it's an invite for us. We've been pushed out of normal to look for God in our lives, to look for Jesus working, and for miracles and faith, and maybe, I don't know how to do this yet, but at the end of the sermon, kind of touch on some of the things we might have seen in the last 18 months. My problem is that I'm struggling with that's different for all people, right? Some people really struggled through COVID and are still struggling, and harder to find these positive moments. And other people, I think, really did find positive in it. So that's an interesting one. I think my congregation is in completely different spots across the board. So how do I ask them to look for Jesus in COVID or in the situation we find ourselves in, when sometimes I know it's really hard for people and I want to honor that. So I'm not done yet. I'm working on it.
Well, yeah, a couple of things came to mind. I don't know how to say this without sound like I'm devaluing one or the other of this. You know, I think about you know, kids that I went to high school with, and some of you know, I lived in the same town, you know, until I graduated from high school. And so there were kids that I would, you know, went to kindergarten with, graduated from high school with, 13 years, and some of them never left. You know, and there's some depth to their roots. There's some relationships built up that are strong and powerful, and they've not experienced much outside of, you know, the cornfields of Central Illinois. You know, I mean, that's sort of where they live their life. And I remember, I mean, I went to high school in Chatham. I went to college in Bloomington, 60 miles away. And my decision to go to Perkins at Dallas at SMU, I mean, the phrase I literally used was I needed to get out of the cornfields, not because it was better somewhere else, but it was going to be different. And that led my life to being, you know, Texas, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Colorado. And I have experienced and seen and witnessed things that I would not have if I'd have spent all my life, you know, still going to the high school football games on Friday night, and, you know, and I've also experienced that some in military folks, for whatever reason, they joined the military. And I've been in a couple of Air Force base towns, an Army base town here. You know, those experiences of traveling around the world expanded their understanding of the way things are and how people lived and how people you know, related to one another. So that I don't quite know where I'm going, other than that struck me that leaving home can be a gift. I mean, it can put us in a place of seeing things that you never would see otherwise, you know. And I love the fact that you're going to invite them perhaps to think about the places where they've seen God as a result of being kicked out of sort of the normal routine. I think that'll work. I like that.
Yeah, those were the parts I was drawn to too. You know, I found myself really thinking about, what does it mean to leave home? And can you leave home even if you know, still reside in the place of your birth and with your family? And I think what I took away from what you were saying, Tiffany, is that leaving home conjures up this idea of getting out of your comfort zone, that somehow you are allowing yourself to be challenged and pushed in your life, even when it's uncomfortable. And that's part of growing, right? That we allow ourselves, we allow God to lead us in these places. And I also, like Kent, I was really drawn to the part where you were talking about the awe. You know, when you talked about their experience of the awe of Jesus preaching, the awe of the healing of the demoniac, and being open to that in those really uncomfortable, unsettling experiences of leaving home. You know, I was thinking about times that I was homesick when I left home, and it was so hard, and I wanted to go back home. But being open to awe and to God's working in those unsettling adventures of life. I found that really compelling.
Also, the disciples, depending on, you know, where you read it, certainly in Mark's gospel, the disciples saw a lot of those amazing things, but weren't quick to identify them with God. They thought, man, this Jesus dude, you know, he's got a good gig. You know, let's follow him, whatever. I mean, I may be over exaggerating, but I think asking people to stop and think about these things that they've seen, and then to ask them, where have you seen God in it? It's important because I'm sure everybody's witnessed God, but they don't know that they have. I mean, the disciples, I'm in Mark as well. They don't get it. I mean, I'm halfway through in my passage. They still don't get it. They don't have any idea, that this is God at work in this way. And so that's the cautionary part of this. You're out of home for whatever reason, and God's at work, and you may just very well miss the whole thing.
Yeah. The other thing I was thinking kind of along those lines was how many people were in the synagogue that day didn't see it at all.
Yeah.
Because they weren't in that out of their comfort zone. They weren't away from home. And maybe they didn't see it as a miracle, but as a betrayal of, the home leaving them while they're in place, right? Like, this isn't what we believe. This isn't what we think. You need to get out. Instead of, and that's not in this text, just understanding the story and how often people were like, I can't believe you're doing something we're not used to, and not being able to see the awe in it.
And Gordon Spencer, I think I've told you this probably on Roundtable. He was the minister of counseling at Boston Avenue Church 100 years ago. And he used to always talk about vacation eyes. And he would drive to work a different way. So that he would pretend that he was an out-of-town visitor. And he would look at his city as if he had never been there before. And what would he see? And it tuned him into things that he would drive by every day or see all the time, and wouldn't stir him or move him at all. But if I came here from Kansas, if I came here from Arkansas, if I came here from Minnesota, what would I see? That I don't see normally. And I think that's an invitation, I think, to put on these God eyes, how do we look at things through those lenses, to see them in a different way? I think that's a good invitation too. So.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you both. So Kent, are you ready to go?
Yeah. Last week I preached in the 8th chapter of Mark's Gospel, where Jesus said he's going to take up his cross and he was going to die and be raised again. And Peter didn't like it, and he told them, you got to take up your cross and follow me. And it was a sermon on sacrifice and selflessness, and is the way to being a big deal. That's how you become a big deal. So now we're one chapter later, and I'm going to read it again. They, Jesus and the disciples, went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands. They will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again. But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, what were you arguing about on the way? But they were silent. For on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down and called the 12 and said to them, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. Then he took a little child, put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. So it's like deja vu all over again, right? I mean, it's the same themes, a little bit different illustration. The persistence that Jesus has in defining his ministry around the cross and sacrifice, and the inability of the disciples to get it, and I could almost preach the same sermon again, and see if they got it this time. There's a couple of things that stand out to me. I don't know. I don't quite know what to do with it, but I know there's two parts of the story. In both parts of the story, Jesus silenced the disciples, right? I'm going to die. And they didn't even ask me any questions. So they had no idea what that was meaning. And then they said, what were you guys arguing about on the way? And they were silent. It says, at least the disciples have stopped trying to argue with Jesus and trying to convince him to believe something else. They stand in silence. There's a few things about this text that stand out to me. We all know this, when you get to the children and you put a child in their midst, which in and of itself, without saying a word, would have been the sermon, right? I mean, because in his context, to invite that child into their midst is to break the social norms, to value an outsider in ways they shouldn't be valued, to take someone who is useless and put them in the middle of those people who are arguing about who is the greatest. So to the very act itself. Now, of course, in our world, we love children, we value them. We idolize them, perhaps in ways that are beyond even what are helpful. But in the text, it wasn't so much about a child as it was about somebody who had no standing or power or significance. So the question that raises to me is, who are we willing to bring into our midst to learn from? Who is it that has been deemed unimportant enough that there's nothing we can value from them, and to put them in our midst to learn from them? And I thought a lot about the edge, Tiffany. I wondered about, I wish I had your resources of stories around that, because I think that's a good place to go for people who are not in the church, don't share our faith, whatever, look and act and behave differently than we do, and yet you put them into your midst to listen from them and to learn from them. So that's something I'm playing with. The other thing that I'm playing with a little bit is this: what kind of a person argues with another person over who of them is the greatest? I suspect a very insecure person is the person who hides behind that bravado and that arrogance and that bragging. I'm the best, I'm the smartest, I'm the richest, I alone can do this. What kind of a person engages in that conversation? And I don't think that's a strong person. I think that's a weak person. Now, this is kind of a little bit of a shift. I don't know if I can get there or not in a sermon, but I wonder if when Jesus put the child in their midst, even though they would never have admitted it, the disciples saw themselves there and were grateful. That is, behind the bravado, the bragging, the arrogance was the sense of, I really am nobody. And I really have nothing to offer. And I really don't make a difference. And when Jesus puts the child in their midst, that's good news. And part of what I'm trying to do, last week's sermon was challenging. Be humble, be sacrificial, be selfless. But we have a whole lot of people who are like that in our congregation, who are wondering if their gift matters, if what humble thing they have to bring makes a difference. I think I may have mentioned this, I don't know. My wife last year took a physical, and they sent her a report. She was reading this report on her report or whatever, and it talked about the result of all the blood tests and all that kind of stuff. And the phrase they used to describe my wife's, at least physical condition, was, this was the honest to God, grossly unremarkable. And I wonder how many people feel grossly unremarkable. And Jesus takes a child, puts it in the midst of them and says, no, this is remarkable. This is where you see who the big deal really is. So anyway, I'm playing with those kind of ideas. I'm trying not to do this 1 week in a row, sort of pick on them. So anyway, what do you think about that? Got any ideas?
I think that is absolutely beautiful, and you've got it. And that whole second piece that you were talking about when he brings the child, I just felt so invited to that scene. I felt like I was standing there in that circle. and where you went with that. I've never heard that in a sermon about this child. That is a whole new way for me to experience that moment. And I was deeply moved by that.
Maybe I just ought to run this tape then.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when you were talking earlier about the teacher part, you know, and trying to imagine who is it that Jesus could put in the circle that we would feel that kind of response to. You know, we may not feel it as much about children, although I think that's still pretty powerful. You know, I was sitting here trying to think about who that would be. And it actually took me back to a place with my sermon last week, and about how Jesus is putting the Samaritan, I preached about the Good Samaritan, and how he's putting this, you know, unlikely teacher forward. And it just made me think again about how Jesus was always doing that, you know, whether it was with a Samaritan or a woman, or here in this case with a child, that was such a part of his ministry, is putting these forward for us to see.
Yeah.
They have something to teach you.
Place them in their midst. I thought that's an interesting phrase. You know, he took a little child and put it among them. You know,
that's what he was constantly doing, right?
Yeah, that's what he was doing.
Putting them among us.
Among us, yeah. So yeah.
So like, so I'm having a really hard time getting over the fact that you remember your sermon from last week.
Well, you know, it's like it reminded me when I read this. I'm like, did I just not preach on this? Yeah. Usually by Sunday at noon, I'm done. Yeah, I've let it go. But I have an interesting little opening illustration I'm going to use. But preaching the same sermon 4 times, but so at least it gave me a way to get into the sermon. But
yeah. What text was that again? You never said which text.
Mark 9:30-37.
Yeah. So they weren't back-to-back stories. Was there something in between?
No, it happens in 8. What's in between them is the transfiguration. And so you've got the take up your cross. You want to live, die kind of thing. Then you have the transfiguration. And then you go back again. And again, in Mark's gospel, as I said last week, it's kind of the hinge. You know, he's figuring out who he is, gathering his disciples, moving towards Jerusalem. He tells them who he is. The transfiguration is sort of Mark's way of God saying, yes, that's who he is. You know, you don't get transfigured until you recognize his connection to the cross. And then he goes back to this journey towards Jerusalem. So it's almost like he picked back up where he left off in the 8th chapter. Okay, now let me remind you where we were. I'm going to die, and you're going to be humble. And so
after the transfiguration, they still did not get it.
They still did not get it. No. And they don't. And they don't in Mark's gospel, right? They don't even at the very end, because the original ending of Mark doesn't have all the resurrection appearances. And there's scholars that believe that this whole messianic secret stuff, which is shot through through this and all the other, don't tell anybody, is sort of the gospel writer's way of saying you have to decide. You decide. When Jesus says, who do the people say I am? Who do you say I am? Which I didn't preach on this part of the last week, but that's still the invitation, right? You can't trust what Peter says. You can't trust what the disciples say. They don't get it. Who do you say that I am? So, I think that the disciples are the foils in Mark's gospel.
Yeah. So, but tying the question of, who is Jesus together with this idea of bringing a child into the center, it almost also feels like Jesus is asking them to look within too. And who are you? Like this idea of, they're outwardly, I want to be the greatest, and arguing it's me, which is often covering up insecurities. and the way you took that and said, you know, that child in the middle, you know, it says that, you know, that I don't know. Let me look for your word. Like does my gift matter?
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
that even theirs does.
The reason I went there was the response of Jesus is not anger and frustration, right? It's not smacking them in the back of the head and say, what in the are you talking about? You know, his response to them was to take a child and set it among them and says, this is the one that captures the essence of what this God life looks like. And so I wonder if Jesus knew that he's dealing with these insecure, frightened, anxious people rather than belligerent, obnoxious, strong folks. And I don't know. I don't know what, can't psychoanalyze the disciples either, but everybody I know that behaves that way is pretty insecure.
Yeah.
They're hiding those kind of fears and insecurities. So Jesus' response is to say, hey, even if you think you have nothing to offer.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
And you're talking about this tonight in Faith Academy class?
I am. We're gonna take a look. I've got to get prepared for that, but we're going to take a look at. We'll look. What I'm going to do tonight, I'm going to do some introductory stuff around church calendar and lectionary, so people kind of get the idea what's behind that, and then we'll get into a couple of the texts tonight. And I'm going to hopefully each week, look at a couple of the texts. So I'm not going to spend much time on Proverbs tonight. I'm not a big Proverbs fan. I think Proverbs are sort of a snapshot of where a culture is around what is common sense or conventional wisdom, rather than being any kind of eternal understandings of how we ought to behave. I mean, the proverb for this week is about what a good woman is. I won't touch that one.
I saw a Facebook post and I didn't read it, but it mentioned this and said, I know people avoid the hard texts, but I'm going to deal with this, how a woman should be and try to redeem it somehow or something. I wish I would have read that post now.
Good luck on that.
Thanks.
Overnight.
All right.
Well, I guess they won't see this until it's over. But anyway, yeah.
All right. Well, good luck this week, y'all.
Hey, everybody, yeah.
Hold your together.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.